All right, welcome. So, intro, the history of the alphabet. We're going to be looking at, this lecture is really about the Western Latin Roman alphabet. You learned in our readings this week that, you know, when you learn about the alphabet development, there were many alphabets obviously developed around the world. I mean, different languages, different writing systems. We're going to be focusing on what we use, which is the Western European alphabet. So when I'm referencing the inventions of printing, for example, we're going to be referencing the invention of printing the Western European alphabet, not the invention of printing other alphabets, because we learned, if anyone remembers from our reading, who invented the first printing of movable type? Anyone remember?
Wasn't it in China?
It was China, and it was like 400 years before Germany. So, so there's a lot of differences depending on what alphabet we're talking about. So that's why I want to just make sure we're understanding what this lecture is about, the Western European alphabet. So let's talk about the first forms of graphic visual communication. Right, the very first graphic communication happened 15,000 BC, over 50,000 years ago, was discovered the cave paintings in Lascaux, France, right? Those cave paintings were showing images of the herds, the hunt. These first forms of written communication were cave paintings, drawings on substrate, stones, clay tablets, animal skins, leathers, leaves, papyrus, wood, bamboo. What did they draw? Right, they were drawing, referred to pictographs. They were, scholars say they were the first paintings or the first attempts at graphic communication. They could be anecdotal, they could be hunting instructions. Of course, we will never know, but they were drawing what they were living with, what they were doing. The first forms of kind of communicating quantities, maybe directions, were starting to be complex scenes that were incorporating dashes, dots, arrows, lines. These were not necessarily spoken language, but concepts that were kind of in communicating maybe quantities, directions, where they're going. I was on a trip to Ireland. This is a picture of Cork University in Cork, Ireland. And they have on their display what they call Olgum stones. So Olgum are carved stones telling stories with this very primitive way of communicating. So this is an open air hallway that kind of opens to that courtyard. And these are the stones on display. My son is in the picture. And at that time, he was like a little under 6 feet. He's 6'3" now, but at that point he was a little under 6 feet, just to kind of give you a concept of how tall and big these stones are. Definitely some in the back there are like 10, 12 feet high. They're just massive. And so the markings on these stones that were the first kind of writing system in these regions were these little dashes that you're seeing happening on the edges of what we call the stem line of the stone. So you see all of these little carved in dashes, and you can see them along the stem line of the stone. So these are considered an alphabet, using 20 characters arranged in 4 groups of 5, with each character made up of between 1 to 5 scored lines or notches. So they've decoded the system and assigned a letter to each one of these notches. And so you can kind of see how they've decoded it. And then here's the stones again with these notches along the stem line. And you can see them as you look at each one, if you look closely. Really what these were is record keeping. They discovered that the way that this form of communication was to record the names of prominent people within the tribe, and using standard style of formats such as X son of Y, X son of Y, descendant of the tribe Z, X son of Y, member of tribe Z. With only one known exception found in Wales, the names are all of men. I don't think any of us are surprised by that, but it's lots of commemorating the leaders of their tribes. So this was happening all around the world. I just found that fascinating when I was visiting there to see these pictograms on display. You don't get to see them like that very often. So that was really interesting to me. So the primal pictograms were really the common rudimentary form of writing. And it became an analytical writing system, making it easier to convey deeper meaning and more elaborately. Here you have this clay tablet found in Mesopotamia in 3100 to 2800 BC. Some 5,000 years later, a more systematic use of pictographs is found in this clay tablet. The areas of the Middle East that we know as Turkey, Syria, and Iraq is where this was found. They were using clay, drawing with sharp reed. And you can see that this is an example of a grid system. You can see the grid lines, horizontal and vertical, creating divisions. Then you can see the pictograms drawn in each one of those divisions. Then you can also see these notches, these kind of indentations. They look like dark shadows, like big dark dots. Those were actually where they would take their finger and press into the clay. So they were inscribed with the grid, then they had the symbol, and then they were using those record keeping of the fingers and the deep indentations representing numbers. So, which means they were counting with their fingers as digits. So fingers are digits, digits are numbers, and computers are digital. Cuneiforms, 300 BC. They're referred to as cuneiforms, meaning wedge-shaped. It's a very early example of how letter forms are driven by changes in tools. Thousands of pictograms were consolidated into 560 cuneiforms. Still, imagine how hard it would be to learn 560 symbols in order to read and write. Literacy was in fact limited to a select few. But I also want you to think about what we do today. Who can tell me, what would we say, what little pictograms are we using every day on our devices to communicate with each other? Emojis, exactly. So we're using emojis every day. Isn't that interesting? Here we have our fantastic 26-letter alphabet with our 10 numbers, and we've made it all so easy for ourselves, and we're going back to what the Egyptians were doing with their 560 symbols. It's just funny to me. We're kind of going backwards. So let's look at that cuneiform development. Here we have the hieroglyphics of Egypt, 1450 BC. Our stylized pictographs. Egyptians combined pictograms, representations of objects, to formulate ideas. These combinations are referred to as ideographs. There were approximately 700 hieroglyphs, so the number keeps rising. So imagine how much harder it is to remember and learn how to use these systems. They're getting more and more complicated. So that's telling us that fewer and fewer people are being able to communicate this way. So then we get to the Holy Grail, if you will. It's called the Rosetta Stone. And we are seeing the 3 different languages in our Rosetta Stone. Oh my gosh, I've lost my spot on my notes here. So once we hit to the Rosetta Stone, we're looking at a writing system, and you can see 3 different writing systems. You can see the hieroglyphs at the top, and then you can see where that's going into the pictoglyphs. And then the first alphabets you can start seeing that the Phoenicians were bringing in. Okay, we're starting to see basically, this is the cradle of the alphabet. This rock is considered the cradle of the alphabet, the Rosetta Stone. And you've probably heard about the product called Rosetta Stone. Who knows what that is? Who's heard of the product Rosetta Stone out there? What does that do? Who can tell me what's that about? What do they claim to do?
Teach you how to speak another language.
That's right. They teach you how to speak another language. So the reason they got their name Rosetta Stone is from the real Rosetta Stone, which was showing 3 different languages, and it's considered the cradle of the alphabet. Where do you think this lives? It has a famous museum. Any ideas? What museum took everything out of Egypt? Any Indiana Jones fans out there? The British Museum. The British Museum, the British went in and took everything out of Egypt. And so that Rosetta Stone, the real one, is in the British Museum. Here in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, we have at our public museum a life-size replica of it. So it's pretty cool to see how big it is, and it's big. We have a life-size replica in our Egypt exhibit at our public museum in Milwaukee. So I'm not sure if the Field Museum has one. Can't remember last time I was there, but I know we have one in Milwaukee. So here is a map just showing you how it all came about, how it all got from place to place. Not confusing at all, is it? Let me simplify it for us a little bit. So down here at the bottom, the early Semitic is where we all started, right? This is where all of the alphabets started. We're going to follow the black line. So we're going to go the Northern Semitic, then the Phoenicians, right? That's where we're at here. We're going into the Western Greek, the Etruscan, the early Latin, and then the Classic Latin. So that's the path of language, of alphabets that we're taking. But you can see by my layout here, all the different ways that the alphabets and language kind of transfer, kind of the paths they all took. Okay, so let's go back to the Phoenicians. 1500 to 1000 BC, a phenomenal consolidation of letter forms was accomplished by the Phoenicians. They found that they did this really, they're credited with doing the 22 consonants, right? 22 consonants written from right to left. They were all traders, and so they were spreading this alphabet. Why? My song that I wanted to play for you, it would happen right here. It's called Everybody Wants to Rule the World. Traders needed to communicate. They needed to be able to sell their goods, communicate with other people from other places different than their own. They need to have some way to communicate. And everyone was speaking their own languages, had their own way of communicating. And there was just nothing in writing, but they needed to keep records. These were businessmen. They needed to keep records. They needed to know what they were selling, how much they were making, what they were selling things for. And so it was really necessary. It's necessary for to get for the traders to have. It was kind of how society was built. It was how civilization was built. So they were trading with the Greeks, and so the Greeks were like, "Huh, we like this Phoenician alphabet. These guys are onto something." So the Greeks adopted the Phoenician alphabet, changing 5 consonants into vowels. That is how we got our A, E, I, O, U. You can thank the Greeks. Sometimes the Greek writing system started from right to left, and then they would go left to right, and then back to left, right to left, left to right. Like they were going down a mountain. They were switchbacking back and forth, back and forth. And then they were flipping letters as they were going. If you were reading to the right, the E would face this way. If you're reading the left, right to left, the E would flip and face the other way. And you can see that in this example. The K is facing left here, and then it's facing right, going the other way. So the E's are switching back and forth, just like the way you're reading it. So not the most efficient way. And I think they were like literally confusing themselves. So eventually the Greeks were like, you know what, let's just do this one way. Let's just go left to right, as we do today. So the Greeks eventually landed on the system that we still employ today, which is reading left to right, the Western alphabet. Greek military conquest and commercial expansion demanded keeping track of information that exceeded the capacity of spoken language. So Greek civilization is credited with the first collection of written documentation, and they invented the library. Now we're starting to see letters that I think look very familiar. What do you think? These are Roman capitals because what? Everybody wants to rule the world, and the great Roman Empire were absolutely all about conquering the world. And so the Romans conquered the Greeks and were like, hey, we're going to take this alphabet. It's fantastic. And they adopted most of the Greek culture as well, for that matter. Like, hey, you know, we like all of this, so we're going to just own it. So the Greeks alphabet and all of their culture was adopted. A good part of their culture was adopted by the Romans. They were also influenced by the Etruscans living throughout Italy at the time. The Etruscan alphabet had the same number of 26 letter forms that we have today. So the Romans, they did add their own little spin on things, and they went ahead and named the alphabet symbols from the Greek alpha, beta, gamma to the individual characters we know as A, B, C, D, etc. So every culture that adapted this alphabet added their own little touch to build on what it was and to give it to where we are today. So the Trajan column is Romans were inscribing, though they were taking the alphabet and they were not just writing it on parchment with pen and ink. They were, being the Romans that they were, and building monuments and taking over the world. They had to leave their mark in a big way. So they were taking and building monuments, and they were carving and chiseling their letter forms into monuments. And so they were, these were literally monumental letter forms, and that we now refer to as monumental capitals. And they are precursors of the capital letters we use today. So in the history of the alphabet, Alan Haley writes, although attempts have been made to tamper with the letter form designs, to condense them, to expand them, to equalize their varying widths, to electronically change their proportions, the consequences have not replaced the design principles set by the Romans and affirmed by their successors. They have become the quintessential melding of art and information. And so by the time we got here to Rome, and they are now literally carving these letters into stone, the alphabet was quite literally set in stone. And this is the alphabet we use today. And this is a tight view of what we call Trajan's column. And it's one of the most preserved, oldest examples of the Roman majuscules carved in stone. But I want you to tell, I think that is a pretty, hold on a minute. I gotta tell this to let you play the sound. Hold on a second. Give me 1 second. Share computer sound.
An extra fee.
I
Are
didn't
you guys
budget for
hearing
that.
that?
Show won't download.
And to those traveling abroad, you could
If you're sitting in a movie theater during previews and you see this, you know to expect a comedy movie. If you see this, you know it's going to be action. Make the letters a little skinny, and boom. It's sci-fi. You know this one's going to have fast cars, this one's going to have Michael Cera, and this one is going to be a rom-com. You don't even need the music to know it. But what about this? This typeface, Trajan, is probably one of the most popular movie poster fonts ever. You can see it in Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon, Double Jeopardy, Letters from Iwo Jima, Titanic, Joe Black, It's everywhere. So how did it get there?
I'm Yves Peters. I'm a graphic designer who has been writing professionally about type and typography since about 10 years.
Yves has looked at a lot of posters, and a few years ago he started to notice a trend.
So I started clicking. I didn't know where I started because I ended up looking at about 16,000 posters.
How many posters did you look at?
Yeah, well, I look at about 100 posters per month, and I've been doing this series since 2006. It's a lot of posters every year. Yeah.
He noticed that the use of Trajan rose significantly in the last couple of decades. But why? In 1989, designer Carol Twombly adapted inscriptions from Roman Emperor Trajan's column into a digital typeface. It was made for Adobe, so it was a part of the software that a lot of people were starting to use to make posters. A couple years later, it made its movie poster debut here for Hector Babenco's At Play in the Fields of the Lord. After that, it was on The Bodyguard and Scent of a Woman. Then it was on 3 1993 box office hits. By 1994, it was everywhere.
It's originally used for epic movies, movies about people that overcome difficulties, like the big war epics and so on. But then you see gradually that it becomes the standard movie font. It's like the Arial of movie posters. So people need to turn out a poster really quickly and they just pick Trajan.
Eventually, that overuse started to change the kinds of movies that would use the typeface.
You don't see it as much on the big productions anymore. It's become the typeface of the horror movies, the B movies, and also the straight-to-video ones. So you see that a lot of posters are for the lesser movies that want to pretend they are better than they actually are.
The rise and fall of Trajan illustrates the downside of digital typeface. The convenience of swapping fonts is a huge shift from the old movie poster days when hand-painted typefaces, or lettering, was an art that was specific to each movie.
So what you see behind me, this is more like the pre-blockbuster thing. Pre-genres, pre-standard styles, and that's why you will be hard-pressed to find two that are similar.
That doesn't make today's genre-specific typography bad design. These visual cliches make it possible to communicate tone and plot details to an audience incredibly efficiently, and there's a certain art to that.
People get nostalgic about the old era of movie posters when everything was still done by hand and still very unique, but you could compare it to music, where some people say, oh, nothing good was produced since the Beatles. But then there's other people say that nothing good was produced since Mozart. Fair enough, but there's many other interesting things that are being produced now. There's just much more, but there's still a lot of very good poster design happening. It's just you need to know where to look.
If you're a college student like me, especially.
All right. So Trajan, pretty familiar, right? You don't even know how often you've seen it. But imagine, I mean, that is the birthplace of our alphabet. So yeah, it's been around a long time. So let's kind of go on and see where it went from there. So the Roman and Holy Roman empires really put their stamp and carved it in stone and started our alphabet off. It really matured into a very extremely harmonious form. The peak of the designed letter form known as Roman capitals. Capitals monumentalists. So you were looking at moving into variations. So the first is square capitals, 100 to 400 AD. Square capitals are a version of the monumental capitals written with ink on parchment instead of chiseled into stone. This is another example of how changes in tools and materials provoke and influence changes in letter forms. So here, they're not needing to put that, these aren't what they're going to be carving, so they can be a little more casual, if you will, right? It has a little bit softer humanistic qualities to it. Rustic capitals came along at the same time because it's essentially the first set of what we call condensed letter forms. Notice how thin and kind of squished they look. Why would that be important? Well, a 200-page manuscript, these were all handwritten by scribes. They would take about 4 or 5 months of labor to scribe an entire book. It would take 25 sheepskins, because that's what you wrote on, parchment, which is sheepskin. And this is an example of how design needs to consider the capabilities and limitations of production techniques and materials. They wanted to get more words on a page, use less sheepskin. Sheepskins were expensive. So they needed to get more on the page. Well, let's make the letters thinner. We can get more on the page. So it really became functional. Then you see here another need occurred, and the idea of using Roman cursive for fast cursive manuscript script. This is really used for notes and book margins. And for legibility, they let some letters extend below or above the line. Who can tell me what we call that today when letter forms go above or below the line? Any thoughts? What do we call that? And type it into our chat if you want. See who can get it in there first. I don't see it yet, but Amy has a ascender, is going above, and then she has defender, but I think she meant descender. Descender goes below. Descender below and ascender above.
That was
Excellent.
correct.
Good, excellent. So then we have this, we call these Roman unicels, 4th century AD. Now we're in the point of the proliferation of manuscript writing, and the business of book production is big business, right? There's all these guys are, writing away. Talk about like carpal tunnel for these guys. I mean, they are just for months on months, they are literally writing these books. And it needs to be done quicker. Labor is expensive. So how can we get this done quicker? Well, changing the shape of the letter forms. So you can see here that these letter forms are much more rounded. Look at the E. It's not 1 stroke down and 3 strokes across. It's 2 strokes. So you went from 4 strokes down to 2. You have 1 curve and 1 in the middle. That equals 2 strokes. If you wrote it straight down and 1, 2, 3, that's 4 strokes. So these little tiny details can save a lot of time when you are writing an entire book. And so little things like that made a big difference. Fewer strokes than the square capitals or the rustic capitals, and a Roman E, we just explained that. So there's still all these capital uppercase letter forms. And so this was used, this design was used in the Book of Kells. The Book of Kells this is like, we're in medieval times, right? So we're in the medieval times. There's a couple cool things happening in the Book of Kells. You can see a grid. You can see a 2-column grid being used. You see the type is in 2 columns. The collapse of the Roman Empire, okay, and its momentum progress. Societies were dispersed and isolated. One significant area of progress was bookcraft. Belief in important religious texts promoted the production of books, and Ireland, being an island away from everybody with high cliffs, no one could conquer Ireland because they were just way away from everyone, and they had really high cliffs. It wasn't easy to conquer them, and they would put their defenses up on these high cliffs so they could see people coming from miles away. So Ireland was spared a lot of the looting and burning and rampaging that a lot of other countries experienced in those medieval times. So the best collection of illuminated manuscripts is in Ireland as a result. And the Book of Kells is one of them. Nearly all books being written in monasteries by scribes were in production letterers. The head scribe was the editor, art director, and the production manager. Letterers collaborated with illustrators who added ornament and image illumination in support of the text. And this is what the type looks up close in the Book of Kells. The Book of Kells can be found on display in Dublin, Ireland. If you go to Trinity University, and they allow you to come in and see, they turn one page a day. It's a giant book. It's like the size of a table, and they turn one page a day, and you can go see this book that was created in 700 AD on display at Trinity University in Dublin. And the last time I was there, I was with family, and no one would stay in line with me to see a book. I was like, what do you mean you guys don't want to stand in line to see one page of a book? That's awesome. Why wouldn't you want to do that with me? Crazy enough, no one would do it with me. So crazy family of mine. So I ended up not being voted out. No one would stand in line for me. So I still haven't, I've been to Dublin multiple times now, and I still have not seen the Book of Kells, because why? There's always a big line. Everybody wants to see it. The cool kids do. Next time I have to go solo. So here's some examples of what we now call, those were the unicles. Now we're looking at what we call half unicles. What do these remind us of? These letter forms are including ascenders and descenders, and these didn't appear until the 6th century AD, and the body of letter form was drawn to what we now refer to as the X height. The X height comes from the mean line, which is the top of the lowercase letter, and the baseline, which is what all the letters sit on. So the space between the mean line and the baseline is what we call the X height. And so the half unicles are designed to sit between the baseline and the mean line, which is half the size of the capital letter forms, or what they were calling as the Roman square capital. And so here's an example of a digital version of minuscules and majuscules. Philosophia Unicase was designed in 1996. And this typeface is based on the minuscules and majuscules of the medieval times. Here's some examples of it in use in books. Here are the Carolingian minuscules, 8th and 10th century AD. Charlemagne became the emperor of Central Europe. And what did he want to do? Rule the world. Yes, they all want to rule the world. So he wanted to rule the world. Similar to the business plans of the Phoenicians, merchants, Charlemagne decided to consolidate writing systems for the use of his government. Regional script styles were multiplying and crippling widespread communication. These standardized lowercase half unicole letter forms are called Carolingian minuscules. The Carolingian minuscules are essentially the lowercase letter forms we use today. So back when the Romans were, carving everything into stone, they only had capitals. There were no lowercase. So we're moving into now this idea of the Carolingians used Roman capitals. They adopted the Roman capitals for headlines and initial caps. But now we have a writing system using lowercase letters. And these are the Carolingian minuscules. So by 800 AD, we have a writing system that combines uppercase and lowercase letter forms, the same that we use today. And it was all because Charlemagne wanted to rule the world. Here's an example of the Carolingian minuscules in an illuminated manuscript. So here we have 1265, the Deus Apocalypse. This Gothic manuscript uses uppercase and lowercase letter forms. It also uses the conventions of columns. You can see it's a 2-column layout. For page layout, it used the type style called textura, the dominant writing style of the Gothic period. So now we're moving into Gothic. Who had the medieval restaurant example? This is what they were kind of going for, right? So they were really going for more like Gothic, right? So this is Gothic, textura, minuscule. Like the Roman rustic capitals, these letter forms are condensed to save space on expensive parchment. Sheep are not cheap. The first page of Genesis in the Gutenberg's 42-line Bible uses textura as the lettering style he made for his metal movable type. So we are now at 1450, and up until this point, all books were being handwritten by scribes, taking 4 to 5 months. Gutenberg comes along and designs the first metal letters for the Roman Latin alphabet using textura as the typeface. And the first thing to be printed, of course, is a Bible, and it's the Gutenberg's 42-line Bible. And this is what it looks like. It is a giant book as well. And there are many of these because this is actually printed. And so they were able to produce many of these books. And I know in the US alone, I think we have over a dozen at various libraries and museums. I had the honor of seeing one of the Gutenberg Bibles in Pasadena, California at the Huntington Library. They too churn 1 page a day, and you can go, there's never a line for it though. You can just go and see it. It's not quite as rare as the Book of Kells, but it's definitely, these are out and about around the world, and we have quite a few of them here in the US. So you never know when you might be at a library or a museum that has one on display. This is what I'm talking about when we're talking about movable type. This is the typecasting tools that were used. Parchment was being replaced by the invention and availability of paper. Wooden blocks of type stamps were being replaced with letter forms cast in steel. And the increased demand for books, including the growth of universities, moved bookcraft from the monastery to production facilities of metalworking and engraving. So Johann Gutenberg was a metalworker, and he cast movable type for the printing press at 1450. And this is a close-up of what metal movable type looks like. So then, as we have the first printing press appear in Germany, the second one we see happens in Italy. And the humanistic book type was the second typeface. So we moved out of the texture, very Gothic type that was based on what the scribes were doing, back to like an alphabet, like what the Romans were carving into their monuments. So we kind of got away from that calligraphic look and into something that feels much more like our alphabets today. And so this is the first Roman type style called humanistic. It's combination of Carolingian minuscules and monumental Roman capitals designed over 500 years ago. This 15th century humanistic book type is remarkably familiar to our eyes today because most of our books are printed in the typeface Garamond, and this Carolingian minuscule monumental capitals is essentially what we call Garamond today. And so many of your books that you've read either for school or novels or what have you are usually set in Garamond. It's very easy on the eyes and easy to read. Very familiar, yes? You've all seen this. And that's it. All right.